You've envisioned where you want to be, so the millions of little decisions you make along the way are all in cohesion to like support that path, right?
Hello and welcome to the Jumpstart podcast with Jeffalytics. I'm your host, Jeff Sauer. Today, for our 36th episode, we're going to talk with Rick Webb, former agency owner, current author, investor, and all-around interesting guy. Rick and I met about 4 or 5 years ago when he came and presented at MEMA in Minneapolis. Now, I was a board member of the organization at the time, and I remember going out to dinner with him after the speech, and we were commiserating over sliders at La Bellevue, which was then the nicest restaurant in town in Minneapolis. Now, I'm not sure that I actually said much during that conversation or really even left an impression. You see, Rick was the center of attention, and all I wanted to do was just listen to what he had to say. This guy had stories for years, insights for decades, and it was just so interesting that I wanted to soak in everything he had to say. He was wise, spot on, and just really a fun guy to be around. So when I got reconnected again with Rick as a potential podcast guest, I thought, I know that guy, he's awesome. So I was looking forward to it for quite some time. Although for me, the chat was actually first thing in the morning, 6 a.m. Thailand time. So I guess I wasn't looking forward to getting up early for it. But it was totally worth it. You see, that wake-up call was an early one. But lucky for me, it was all about Rick's experiences guiding the conversation. And it really went great. Rick shared insights about how he got into advertising, basically because it was cool, how technology factored into the process, and the inflection points that led him to a career as an agency owner. We talked about his origin story, what he learned, and even about his book about running a digital agency. And he had me entertained the entire time. So I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Rick Webb. Visit jeffalytics.com/Rick for show notes. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'll call it digital for you. I know that you've been in a lot of marketing positions and elsewhere. But just how did you know that this is the right career path for you?
Yeah, well, it's definitely digital before advertising. I've always been a computer geek. I'm 44, so I'm that generation of Commodore 64 and Apple II people. And My mom was a teacher, so she always was very big on technology and sent me to computer camp and things like that. So it was always computers. There was no internet. And so I didn't really know what to do with it, I thought about architecture for a long time because I think in hindsight that it's the same thing of like mixing creative and tech. But I didn't go that route. I got into a school for architecture and I realized it was a 5-year degree and there was no way in hell I was going to pull that off.
Yeah.
So I went for computer science and but pretty rapidly I realized it wasn't super, this is 1990. It wasn't super helpful. Mm-hmm. I loved tinkering on computers, but when I went to Boston University and I went there from Alaska. I grew up in Alaska. And, pretty rapidly I realized that I could just sort of learn the languages on my own. I got the books, the textbooks, and I was just like, okay, I can learn these. Yep. And B, the jobs weren't really that exciting, it seemed really far away to get into video games or something fun. And so in Boston, with Route 128, it was pretty much like you're going to go end up working at Digital or something like that. And that didn't seem very exciting.
What was computer science like back then? Was it, obviously the web isn't invented, or at least not in curriculum in 1990. No. So what is it, like desktop programming, or how does it, what do you do?
For me, it started out like a lot of people, it was desktop. It was like, I owned an Apple II. And I learned BASIC and then Pascal and then started getting into like C and a little bit of Lisp and things like that. We had computer classes in high school and there was some camps and stuff. So I started, I understood terminals and basic Unix commands and stuff like that. But that hopped from like coding for a personal computer on the desktop where you were coding software, saving it to disk and it would run on another computer to like the whole networked thing was a little vague back then,
Yeah.
Networking wasn't really a thing. And so when I got to college, it was a lot of the network stuff. And it was interesting, but I just didn't see a path that was creative in it. So I kind of just wanted to switch majors pretty badly. My parents wouldn't let me be an art history major, so I just chose economics kind of randomly.
Nice.
Which doesn't make any sense really because it's also not very creative, but it was all, my parents were paying for the school and I was on a scholarship, and they wanted something that I could get a job for,
Yep.
But simultaneously to that, I stayed into my computers and my Apple, and then into Macs, and I got really into like desktop publishing as well. So after college, there's kind of like no parallel between college and after college, basically. I got until way, way, way later. I got my degree in economics, but I pretty quickly ended up working in design and desktop publishing. It was back in the era of like PageMaker and Illustrator and Quark Express. And there was a pretty big demand for that stuff in Boston. And it was really just a matter of if you knew the applications, you could get a job. So I kind of just went for it. I graduated early, and I think I was about 22, 23 when I started working in it. And I just, there's this company called at the time Mac Temps. And basically you go in and you take a test on the applications, and if you pass it, you get a job. So they said they had a lot of demand for Quark Express. So I went to my friend's house who had a copy, and I just learned the application, went in and aced the test, and started working in desktop publishing.
So now you're the expert because that's funny.
Yeah, it's still kind of pre-internet, but it was using computers, and it had a design side of it, and it was like kind of a good mix of design and tech, and I enjoyed it a lot. And it was a lot of like desktop publishing, and then what would now be PowerPoint presentations. I think PowerPoint might have existed, but it was very rudimentary, and it was a lot of like printing to slides and printing to acetates and things like that for corporate presentations.
Yep.
And so I kind of I did that for day jobs, and I worked in music at night, and I had a little record label, and I had a band with some friends, and I really just worked as little as possible in business while doing some music stuff. And it's kind of related because I put this band on tour that I really liked, but no one had ever heard of, and I lost a bunch of money, so I decided I better pay my debts and get a full-time job. So I took a job at Ernst & Young.
Nice.
And it's funny in hindsight because I learned so much there, and I spent so much of my career in consulting companies that when we did eventually start the Barbarian Group, I knew a lot about proposals and RFPs and all of that already. So it did work to our advantage. But at the time, I kind of hated it. But yeah, it was really educational. We had the Sony account, and we for logistics on the Vios, and we did a lot of PeopleSoft and Oracle implementations, and it was kind of like a good sort of crash course business school education. That's generally who they hire into other departments. They hire people with MBAs to go be consultants, but I had gone in through marketing and design. But because I was making all this stuff for them, I picked it up. And the other relevant thing there is that Boston, for Ernst & Young, they kind of had this centers of excellence model. And they chose Boston and its Cambridge office to help with EY.com in 96. So I was 24 at that point. I had been out of school about 4 years. And that was really I was aware of the internet already, and we were working on it. But that was really, we had all the software to work on it. And I really that's when I picked coding back up and learned HTML and JavaScript when it first came out and things like that. And that was when I was like, okay, I got to get back into this internet thing. Or not that it exists,
Yeah. I mean, it's the beginning of it, but yeah, you got to get back to your roots of being technical and being able to write code. And now the code you write actually has the ability to reach people that you want to reach. It's pretty
it was cool. And I got really into early, I did some political activism back then, and I made a blog for it before there was blogs in 96. I think it's still up. Stuff like that. I got really excited with the whole concept of using the publishing potential of the internet and things like that. I had one more detour where I got seduced and went to a recording studio to work for a couple of years in Boston. It was a great studio called Prophet Sound, and they did a lot of they had the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and all these cool bands from Boston, Sam Black Church and stuff, and I enjoyed all that. But I lasted about a year there, and then from then on, it was digital primarily through agencies. Because, at that point, I had a bunch of experience freelancing at agencies. I probably worked at my first agency in 93 or 94 through Mac Temps that turned into Aquent Partners. That's their name now.
Okay.
So, I had kind of a good resume. I started freelancing at agencies because now I knew the internet stuff, and that was getting bigger. And I already had experience at agencies and page layout and stuff like that. So I kind of my agencies from after the recording studio to starting the Barbarian Group were Philip Johnson Associates in Boston, now goes by PGAA, and then a brief stint at Digitas, and then Arnold. I was at Arnold for a long time.
Yeah. I think Arnold's where you met Tim Brunel, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was like kind of an epiphany after the Ernst & Young period when I was at the studio in PGAA. I was doing a lot of mechanical and page layout and presentations, and there's this very like specific moment I often refer to as the moment when I realized that I wanted to be in advertising, because all like PGAA and all the agencies I worked at before, I was generally on the design side. Most of the big agencies have a design department, but I wasn't in the advertising side. But I was at home one night and I saw the first. I don't know if it was. I remember seeing two Volkswagen ads. One was right when Arnold won the account. They did this sort of brand statement ad, and it had this band I really love, this crazy obscure band that like nobody had heard of, that I just couldn't fathom that you could put them into an ad. And then not long after, they did the new Beetle launch, and they had all that spate of ads that to this day people remember, with like the Orb doing Little Fluffy Clouds and Spiritualized doing Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space. And these are like some of my favorite bands. And I was like, oh my God, you can make money doing this. This is insane.
Nice.
So, that was one of those, I was already in advertising agencies, but that was it. I was like, I got to get to Arnold. So everything about my career for the next year or two was tailored to getting to Arnold, and that's where I met Tim.
Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. So it's fun to hear this, because it seems like everything sort of like was the perfect storm getting into that advertising area, and a lot of it had to do with at first. And I think this happens in a lot of people's careers. At first, if you're young and you get responsibility, it's mainly because you know how to use the technology, whereas people who had been around a while might not be able to. So you're sort of exposed to these people who are experts in their field, but you're being relied on for your expertise because you can use the system. And then eventually you can sort of learn by watching these people what a real business is like, or what it's really like to expand. And it seems like that's what you were able to do as well.
Yeah, there's always this like sort of cutting edge of marketing technology that they generally, and I'm one of them now, that the practitioners of the trade have to rely on the kids for, right? So now it's probably like VR and social still to some extent, although that's going away and turning into a professional playground or professional world. But yeah, I was aware of Silicon Valley and I was aware of tech, but we didn't have the big sort of sites yet. You know what I mean? There wasn't Facebook, there wasn't Friendster, there wasn't any of that. And it was like, there's Apple and things like that, but that seemed completely unreachable from Boston. And, I was reading Wired, and there was kind of like, there's the big cool new digital agencies in New York, like Razorfish, that we all thought were really cool. So you weren't really thinking back then about like whether you're going to a startup or you're going into advertising. You just wanted to work on the internet, and you took what jobs were available in that town. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I remember a couple years later, like right around the beginning of Barbarian Group, I had a really good friend in Boston, and he was like, I got to get out there. I'm going to Silicon Valley. I want to be part of it. And I thought that was really brave, but it was never really realistically on my radar to leave Boston at that point. So, going through the Digitas to Arnold and working on the Webb route through agencies was the only realistic route. And plus I really loved the graphic design. I loved like all of that side of it. I didn't really know anything about advertising back then, but I knew a lot about design. I had always loved the graphic design through like record labels and things like that, so it seemed fine at the time. Plus there's this other, I can never find it to this day, but there was an article in Wired kind of at the height of the dot-com boom. So I would say this is probably like 99 or 2000 that explained sort of what stock options were and the whole sort of concept of you get paid less to get these pieces of paper that may or may not be worth anything. Mm-hmm. And the average salary in a startup was about $20,000 less than the average salary in an agency. And I was like, well, okay, screw that. I'll take the cash. So even if I had thought about like picking up and moving to like the Valley or something, I would have just wanted the money.
Yeah. Well, and you probably would have had to come back if you would have done it, if you would have timed it incorrectly.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, I spent the boom at Arnold, and we started Barbarian Group in December of 2001. So right at the bust and right after 9/11. And, if I was out there, I just would have been screwed.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about starting the agency. So you get experience at a few of the agencies in town. You're sort of a subject matter expert on the execution and the tools and everything by this point. And now you're like, I want to get into agents. I want to start an advertising agency or an agency. What does the Barbarian Group start with? Like, what services do you provide? What was the genesis of doing that?
Yeah, well, like, I would say that, like, Arnold was a really, really amazing place back then. It was like Adweek's Agency of the Year, 3 years running. The Volkswagen account was one of the hottest accounts in America, and they were really doing digital really, really well. And there was just an amazing group of people there. It's crazy now. I mean, like, the people we worked with are all over the place. Tim's one of them. Will McGinnis is out in San Francisco running an agency. Like, it's nuts. So it was a great group of people, and I had already known one of the co-founders of the Barbarian Group, Ben Palmer, who was my friend already for years at that point. And he had been freelancing at Arnold, but he had gone over to one of the few sort of startups in Boston. There were a lot of like pure tech startups, but sort of a webby startup called DMod. And it was really like he had this insight at the beginning that like, the way these, so what we were doing is we were building all these Flash mini sites, right? Like, it was all mainly Flash, although, I did the HTML and the non-Flash versions as well, because you always had to have a backup back then. But every, like, basically, let's just use Volkswagen. Every car, like a Jetta or Passat, would have a different mini site. And, it was a full build in Flash, a whole, like, little application, essentially. And every one of them was unique, and every one of them was different. Everyone looked different, and they all had a different style to match the car. And there started to rise this sort of like cadre of like Flash superstars, right? Like these guys that every agency hired over and over again. And they didn't really like work at agencies. Some did, but some were freelancers. Some worked at like there's some people that like, Heavy and WDDG in New York that were like kind of doing video stuff as well and tech stuff. But like Ben kind of looked at the whole situation and said, this is weird because this is kind of like if an ad agency decided they were going to keep David Fincher on staff, right? Like, like we went through this in the 30s, and it was kind of silly, like because you have your art director and creative director and producer at the agency, but these real craftsmen that care about craftspeople that care about the craft, they get bored working on the same thing all the time. They're working on personal projects on the side. They're not going to really be employed at the agencies. And that was kind of his big insight at the beginning. And he was like, we should just be this like band of superstars that work for all of them, building the stuff we want to build. And then, any of them can hire us. And so it was me and Ben and two of those such people, Keith Butters and Robert Hodgin, that really like kind of got together at the beginning. And it was really Ben that sort of gathered us all together. Like, I think Keith and Robert had been burned before, but somebody else trying to start one of these. And and like people like having salaries. And, so Ben really got us together. And then simultaneously to that, Robert, who was one of these people, he had been working at a Arnold affiliate company. He got but he had gone freelance, and he got this project from Wyden and Kennedy that really kind of just proved this other point that like the sites were getting more complex than one person could build, right?
Yeah.
Like if you look at those early Flash sites like Turbonium, there's no backend, there's no database, there's no social, there's nothing. You just tinker around with it. But pretty quickly, like people got into like making these sites that had like database connections, so you could do contests or you could like send e-cards, And Robert got a bid for one of those from Wyden and Kennedy that was based on a contest for Nike that had it needed like a whole database and backend that he just couldn't build. So I think that kind of helped them see the writing on the wall that like it was going to be hard to keep. He really like he's a great coder actually, but he doesn't love it. I think that kind of proved it to him that like being with a gang would make these things more obtainable. He could do his part, and other people would worry about the parts he didn't like.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I love the name, obviously, the Barbarian Group, just people coming together that are sort of like, like almost like freelancers joining together, a group of individuals who are super talented in one area. And it's funny that you said that one of them, that they got burned by other people trying to consolidate a bunch of freelancers and create this super agency. I think a lot of us have been there in this business, and that is people trying to align every single type of skill and to create this thing, but it really takes good leadership and clients to make that happen. If you don't, it's if you don't make any money, no matter how good you are at what you do, it's really hard to survive as a company, right? So you need to have these clients coming in, you need to have the use case. So it's cool that you were able to decide to work together and get a project at the same time or a similar, right around the same time.
Yeah, I mean, Robert really bringing that Wyden and Kennedy project was awesome. I was going to quit Arnold on September 12th, but 9/11 happened, and I went in, and he was like, look, you're going to get laid off any day now. I had put in my notice the Friday before, and he was like, you're going to get laid off any day now. So if you want, I can just tear up this resignation letter and you can get your benefits. But I was already pretty committed to that. But then, we were a little scared that like that was going to mean we had no work because nobody knew what was going to happen to advertise. I mean, who cares about advertising when, people are dying? But what happened instead is that the internet kind of proved its viability as a cheaper alternative pretty quickly. And they had laid off all their sort of digital departments thinking it was the easiest to get rid of. And then all of a sudden people's budgets were being cut and they kind of were into the internet being cheaper. So we ended up actually getting a lot of work. And Robert's RFP from Wyden, we won that, and that gave us a lot of credibility with Arnold, who didn't, that kind of changed the whole appearance of it from a bunch of us quitting and then milking them to kind of proving what we're saying, that we're going to work with a lot of different people. So that kind of worked. I would also say there were actually 7 of us. There's the 4 of us, me, Ben, Keith, and Robert. But then we also had a business guy, we had a finance guy, and very quickly, I think within 3 months, we added another technology guy. Keith had a pretty solid tech chops, but Aubrey Anderson. And these days I consult with a lot of agencies and I see these people starting on 1 or 2 people and I just can't imagine how they did it. We had 7 and it was still just nonstop work for ages.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a tough environment too, to have 7 people that you're responsible for. And that, you have to have a lot of revenue in order to support that, or some kind of backer to get. Well,
I actually think the opposite, because we were partners and we were all in it together, and we all had a little bit of savings, so we didn't have to pay any of us for a while.
Oh, that's nice.
And then we kept the books and paid people who needed it and fixed it later. But you got these people that are one man shops, and then they have to hire 4 people right off the bat. They got to pay them every day. At least we went about, I think, 9 months. We won a big Saturn job in the summer of 2002. So we're probably 7 months old at that point. And that was what gave us the ability to finally get an office and start paying ourselves. But we were 7 months old at that point,
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. That's a long time to have that uncertainty. But it seems like once you got to that point, it started to grow from there. I mean,
and it was growing before that. I mean, that first job for Wyden was probably $20,000, radically underbid, like you do back then. And after that, there was a good steady stream of small jobs from Arnold and then Goodby. Also because of an Arnold guy, Will McGinnis, that moved from Arnold out to San Francisco working at Goodby. So we had steady work. It just wasn't enough to get an office or pay everybody all the time a real salary, But nobody was starving. We could dole out checks where they were needed, and rents in Boston were $300 back then. So,
Wow.
Yeah, I think mine was $320 or something.
That's incredible, for anywhere really, but especially for Boston.
Yeah, well, I was pretty committed to living cheaply back then.
Yeah. Well, that's neat. I mean, it's working out at this point, just in your timeline, you're getting going there, and then you do this for quite some time, right? I'm just looking at your LinkedIn. It's you.
Yeah, I did it for 10 years.
For 10 years, right? So
I mean, 2002 was the first full year. We probably did 500,000, and then it pretty much doubled every year after that. Yeah, there was no looking back until the recession of 2008. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah. So is it just natural? It's naturally growing because of your skills, because of the internet, because of the economy bouncing back, or is it all those things combined, or how does that part
opinion on that through the years?
Yeah.
At the time, I really thought, and I don't believe this anymore, and I'm writing a whole book around kind of this stuff, but I really thought that and you'll see this slide everywhere, that the money's just moving to the internet because the attention is moving to the internet. You know what I mean? That the money follows the eyeballs. And, that's true sort of, but we weren't doing we were doing some banners, but we weren't doing programmatic. We weren't doing Google AdWords. We were only doing these creative branding projects, and that money has not typically moved over the internet so much. So I thought that's kind of what it was, but as the years went on, it got a little bit more obvious that wasn't the case. One thing that Ben did that was very smart at the beginning is after those 7 people that were kind of like co-founders, the first person we hired beyond us full-time was a PR person.
Okay.
So, we're in the dot-com bust at this point through 2002 and 3, right? So, like, it was pretty easy for us to get freelancers whenever we needed another Flash person or another coder or something like that. So, for the first couple of years, we stayed very true to, like, Ben's kind of original vision that we would stay small and hire people as needed and, be kind of a base camp for these people. So, what he did is he hired, like, a PR person early on and to get the word out about ourselves. So, that really did help a lot.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good insight there, is to, even if things aren't looking good from an overall perspective, if you want to grow, you need to get your name out there. And what better time than when it's down?
Yeah, a lot of work came organically through people, a lot from Arnold and then people leaving Arnold. We met a bunch of people at Goodby and they went to other places. So we picked up Crispin because this guy, Jeff Benjamin, left Goodby and went to Crispin. So there was like this sort of word of mouth thing going on. But the PR and the press really helped sort of augment that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the services you're providing are mostly for other advertising agencies at this point? Like you're the experts in execution and there,
Yeah, like for the first several years, like 2 or 3, it was almost all ad agent. Well, that's not true. So most of it was working to ad agencies. Pretty quickly, Nike, we were working for a division of Nike called ACG, which is like all conditions gear. It's like their outdoor gear for kayakers and people like that. And they're kind of too small for Wyden to care about. And it was digital, and Wyden wasn't really doing a lot of digital at the time. And RGA didn't care because it was really small. So we had a direct relationship with Nike very early on the ACG account. So we had one kind of direct relationship. And the vast majority of the rest of it was with agencies. And I would say that probably the mix started to go in the other direction, like after the Subservient Chicken. So probably like 2005 or 6.
Tell me the Subservient Chicken. Is that... I think I know what it is, but let me know. Tell me what it is.
So Crispin, who we'd been doing a bunch of work for, they're an agency in Miami. They've since moved to Boulder. They're kind of like one of the hot agencies. After the reign of Arnold, I would say the 3 big hot agencies in the U.S. were Goodby, Wyden, and Crispin. And we had the luxury of working with all of them, but they had the Burger King account. And
yes,
Jeff had moved over there from Goodby, and he was working on it. And this guy, his name is Mark at Crispin, came up with like the broadcast spots for the Subservient Chicken, which are kind of funny TV ads. Nobody remembers those, but they were really good. And it was kind of like a guy bossing around this weird dude in a chicken suit with garter belts. And then him and Jeff and Ben kind of came up with this idea for this weird site that you could sort of, it was like kind of
you
like
could tell the chicken what to do, and then it would do it for you, right? It was like all full motion video. Yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
So that was like a big viral marketing deal. It was kind of like one of the first things that proved like the premise of viral marketing, that you could get attention without paid media. It got a lot of press, and so after that, we started getting a lot of inbound that was not directly from agencies, And it was kind of a weird period. I knew, and we were paying a lot of attention to the sort of the agency versus production company thing. But a lot of people that wanted to hire people weren't really paying attention to it. It was really like an era of confusion around credit, around like who's doing what, around are these agencies hiring these people? Can I just hire them directly? And I kind of just seized the chaos. And whenever people would ask, they'd email and inquire, we would just be like, yes, we'll do it. So from 2005 or 6 on, we really started going hard to like own the relationships and expand our services and become like a more full service digital shop.
Yep.
So by that point, we were doing like creative and art direction, back end technology, development, engineering, front end. We had a very good accounts team that this woman, Shelby McLeod, had started. We had like, copywriting, and we started getting into planning and strategy and UX, and really just expanding to like become like an all-in-one sort of offering for people.
Yeah.
And so through 2006, 7, and 8, that balance just steadily tilted from, 80-90% of our work being with brand agencies to like 80-90% of it being direct to brands. There's a really big win in there for Kashi, the cereal company, where we like became their digital agency for everything. I think that was in like 2007. But that was really like, from that point on, it was like, all right. I remember by the last year before we sold it, it was like rare. Every once in a while, one of our old clients had something that was right up our alley, and we'd do an agency project. But
yep,
it got rarer and rarer.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is there better margins in going directly to the customer versus being the production shop? Is there more satisfaction? Was this a good move? How would you describe the move and the switch? Was it sounds gradual.
At first, it was actually sort of disorientingly annoying, because what you don't realize is that agencies have a very robust account and production layer.
Yes.
And they know what they're doing. And like when you work with a client direct, especially that sort of dawn in the internet time, but I think it'd be applicable, it was applicable in the last few years with mobile and social, where like every client you get direct is like a first time client. And you have to train them, and you have to babysit them, and you can't move as fast. So at first it was kind of like unpleasant to move over, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But over time, like as like once we had Shelby, like she had worked at Goodby and she wanted to move back east. So she was an experienced account person at a real agency. And then when we opened up the New York office, we got some more people that we hired, like this woman, Stephanie Smirglio from Ogilvy, where they had very deep learning into how to handle an account, and it got better. And then, after the production nightmare of it got better, the possibilities opened up where you could like really, you'd be talking to decision makers and you could really do something, Like there was a year or two in there where we would partner with other agencies on pitches, and it was just kind of pointless because like they needed to have digital to show that digital was part of what they could do and that they had it taken care of. But we were always just like one slide at the end of the deck.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't really like you could really talk about your amazing ideas and plans for digital. It was just kind of this add-on. So once we sort of grew grew up enough to like handle production and accounts with people that are less experienced, we could start like bringing in me and Ben initially as strategists, and then like once we had a strategy department, bring them in, and we could do something more with the client than we would have through an agency. So in the long term, I think it was worth it, but it was not without its growing pains.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. My agency did the same thing where we were known for doing execution, and then said, okay, well let's start doing the whole thing, the whole advertising agency thing. And it gets difficult because your team composition changes, the type of people you need to bring in, like you mentioned, changes, and there's just a lot of changes, and it can be difficult for the person who wanted to just be a subject matter expert to now be responsible for quite a few different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we handled like the cultural changes really well, and nobody was like really bent out of shape about it, and were blessed with enough inbound work that we could, kind of hold our guns. So it wasn't one of those situations where the account people had like, Finlandization syndrome or Stockholm syndrome and like thought they were the clients. Everybody was very much a team, and that worked really well. But you get people in there that didn't really know what the other people were doing. Mm-hmm. But I think by and large it was kind of the right thing. We tried to thread the needle a little bit because we were really into like experiential and we wanted to get a little bit more into retail, and we were always like, we were building software, and we sold some software to Apple, and we wanted to keep our technology chops and we wanted to push that forward, but it was hard with like clients that just wanted banner ads, but I think we did a good job, but it was very like constantly holding the line on that, pushing to like keep the like interesting stuff happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some clients
doing cool stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that was like a full-time battle to like make sure that always happened,
Interesting. So do you think that that's still the right move that an agency might take, is to start out being a subject matter expert and then to expand from there?
So like, I wrote that book Agency, and my premise in there is that is how most creative services shops start now, right? In the old days, like you had Mad Men, and it was exactly like in the show. You like an account person and a copywriter and an art director from an agency decided they're going to go set off on their own, and they set off on their own, and they had all worked in advertising before, and they'd all worked at ad agencies before, and they needed clients, but they knew how the business worked. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But now the vast majority of these firms, I think, are started by people that are practitioners of a trade that get more work than they know what to do with. they're a bit of a hustler. They see there's some potential there. They hire a person or two maybe without even thinking about it. And then suddenly they're like a shop, and then they have to think about their future, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So ad agencies still start in the traditional older way, but like I think most of them now start this way. So inevitably you've got like 5 or 10 people and you're doing something and you kind of like, it feels like a bit of a grind and you wonder where it's going. And there are these moments where you have to make some decisions, you know?
Yep.
You can double down and just do what you do, or you can sort of like expand into like other capabilities. And then you got these clients that love you, and you know, they're kind of dangling temptation at you all the time, right? If you succeeded in any way and you've got a good client, and say you're handling all their graphic design, and they'll be like, can't you just do this email? Can't you do this website? And you're like, no, I'm a print designer. But, you know, they're like, look, I could give you all the money or I could give you half the money. Even if you don't want to do it, I'll take all the money and go find me a print designer. They want like one-stop shopping. You know what I mean?
Yep. Oh, yeah,
so
for sure.
There's a lot of pressure to like sort of expand your capabilities once you have one of these. And it really like, you know, it depends on what you're going for and what your purpose is in starting this thing. And that's why in my book, I like spend an inordinate amount of time at the beginning asking people, why are you doing this? And we hadn't, you know, we had a lot of us, so we hadn't really thought it through beyond like, it's cool and we want to do some work and we like the internet, but we hadn't really thought about where we were going to be in our lives in 5 years or 10 years. And we had to eventually stop and sort of talk to everyone and figure out what people wanted and try and make a plan that accommodated everyone, or if it couldn't, like make sure they were treated fairly. And, you know, that stuff is pretty hard, but from a financial point of view, like expanding your capabilities is pretty inevitable unless you're like deeply, deeply devoted to one craft, which I, as you can tell from my background story, I never really was, you know?
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, is that there's a ceiling on being really good at one thing and specializing in one thing. And there's a lot of revenue to be had by expanding, but also, you know, as more revenue comes in, the complexity of the business increases. So you need to make sure that you plan for that and understand what you're getting into and go in there. I don't think most agencies will have that direction. They'll just go after the revenue and then sort of like afterwards say, hey, how does this affect us? Or did we do the right thing or not? And so the more deliberate you can be in reading your book, for example, is a good way to at least have an approach where you're asking the question before you seek the answer.
Yeah, there's a ceiling, but it should be said that the ceiling's pretty big, right? Like I have a whole section in the book about like how rich do you want to get? And this is like not somewhere to become a billionaire, but you can get pretty wealthy from it. But you know, there are very large shops out there that only do one thing and they do it really well. You got companies like Pivotal that for a long time just did paired programming, you know. You got like large UX consultancies that have existed, like Adaptive Path. You have like very large design firms like Pentagram. If you're really into like one thing, you can do that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people I find like don't really know one way or the other, you know. I think for most people that get into this industry, they're in it because they're good at a thing and they realize that there's some, like, they could get some money out of it, because otherwise why aren't they just staying freelance and solo? So like they're kind of a bit of a hustler a little bit, or somebody is in the organization, and therefore like there isn't this mental obstacle. Like they're probably going to expand their services in that scenario, you know. Eventually you realize that like some services pay a lot more than others, and there's very different margins for a designer versus an engineer versus a strategist. And you know, by the end, like, God, our margins on strategy and UX and content, like strategy and stuff like that, were just astronomical compared to like design and development, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the more you expand, the more you can figure out where your cash cows are, what the things you need, what are just sort of like just to keep the lights on, or you need these things to put it together. And then you can start to market the services that are more aligned with the things that make you money, or at least get as much of that as you can.
Yeah, and then you have the whole like where the world's going, right? So like when we were doing this for a while, we were making some pretty good money off of banners. It wasn't really our like primary focus, but it was good money, and they were quick to do. And some of our Flash people liked them. One of them called them "Little Moments of Zen." And but that stuff eventually like got outsourced to like the Dominican Republic and stuff. Yeah. You know, like you had to go higher up the food chain to make sure that you were like gonna keep getting work. You know, engineers get outsourced to Eastern Europe and India, and like it was kind of, to us, it seemed like it'd be better to be like a higher end shop that was like, had the ear of somebody high up in the organization, and they understood that we were like a premium offering, and we weren't competing on price with like people in countries that could afford to live much less expensively than us,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So does that influence, obviously you're seeing all this as you're in the business, and you're going from being subject matter expert to being a well-run business that's expanding, to seeing all the writing on the wall and even thought leader in this area. What makes you ultimately decide to leave the agency space? Is it because you did what you wanted to accomplish? Was there any particular reason for that?
So, a couple things. One, like, it's nice to hear you say it was well run, but at the time, what I didn't understand, like, we felt like we were always broke, right? And I know this is common to everybody that owns some sort of services shop, because after I put my book out, I went to South by and places like that, and I talked to these people, and it was like group therapy, right? Like, and I have clients now, and they say the same thing. But really what's going on is you're growing, and growth takes fuel. So every penny of profit you have, you just put back into the company to grow, right? So like, oh, I got a bunch of extra money. That means I can hire another designer, or I can expand into like strategy, or I need a UX person, or this or that. And you just know in your soul that like, if you get a little bit bigger, you can like get more work. And we did that steady for 10 years, I mean, there was a sale in there, but it didn't really change anything in that sense. And it's exhausting. It's really exhausting. And everyone I talk to that does it for any more than 5 years, like, is tired. It's like a very difficult thing. And I definitely, like, I felt like it was like hurting my health a little bit. But also, so that's kind of the negative answer, like I do always feel like obliged to point out that like, it's not like we were like swimming in money at any point during the whole thing, right? Yeah. Like we'd get the money and it would just keep going up. And I think at one point we had like $1 million payroll, and we'd bring in like 1.6, and it would pay the rest into rent and hiring people. And then we had no money again, Yeah. And it was just insane. But we actually broke through that at the end. And we sold in 2009, and I would say by the end of 2011, we had broken through that a little bit. Like, in your early years, you get all the money and you pay all the bills, and there might be like 10 grand left in the bank account, then 20 grand if you're lucky. But like by that time, we get through everything, and there might be 100 grand left in the bank account at the end of the month. And that was great. Like I could it started to feel like it was running really well. And I had like really good people running all the different departments. Ben was handling creative with some really great people with him. We had really good like CTO. We had a great head of accounts. We had a great producer. We had a great head of planning. And like for me, like it was kind of like, what do the different partners want? And I started to realize I was the odd one out at that point. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, Ben was like, well, I want to do this for a long time. I'm really happy. And I was getting like newly enamored the more I understood about startups. And, like I'd watched everything happen with like Friendster into like Facebook, and I was into Twitter, and I like kind of knew, and we were trying to do some startup stuff at the company, but I realized that the company wasn't really helping us in that quest. And one day I just had this epiphany that I was trying to turn what was essentially an ad agency into something else, when everybody, or a lot of the people there, liked working at an ad agency. So that kind of was the moment I realized maybe it was me, right? Like I kind of ended up, basically the pitches would come in. I had a great new biz team. I had great creative. I like had assembled this great process to make the proposals. I'd show up at the pitch with them, and it was great. And then the only other time I saw the clients was when they wanted to call and yell at me on the phone, which is not the funnest job in the world. And so I kind of realized that it was me that was the weird one, and that I should probably just move on.
So I agree that some people just want to be at their agency forever, and that's totally cool. And then some people, especially the ones who are like the self-starters, who see these things, are like, hey, if I was successful in this area, and this is pretty much running how I want it to, what's the next challenge for me? What's the next thing? Like maybe, you said that you wanted to start an advertising agency as quickly as possible in the 90s, right? Because it was so cool. But then eventually it's like, okay, well, I also think that social is cool. I think that these other areas are cool. And so
Well, I think like one way of looking at it is like agencies are a way to make money, but they're sure not the easiest way to make money, right? And the longer you go, you meet many, many, many people. You learn a lot of stuff. You grow up, and you start to have more opportunities. A lot of these companies are started by outsiders. I didn't know anyone. I grew up in Alaska, and we started in Boston, which is a decent ad town, but it's not like we were in New York or anything. And but by the end, we had moved the headquarters to New York. We had offices in New York and San Francisco and Boston. I had lived in all of them. I met 1 million people. And like there were other things I could do, and there were like other ways to like sort of make a living that were in some ways easier. I never like lost interest in the topics at hand, but I would also say that like, and actually I never really left the business because what I did at Tumblr was very similar in a lot of ways. But eventually I think you want to try it from a different angle. You want to do something else. You want to like, I don't know. It was never my passion to be in an ad agency. Over those years, I became very fascinated with advertising as like a cultural force. And I'm very fascinated with it in that way. And I've learned a lot more about it. I didn't know anything at the beginning, but I wanted to sort of learn every part of the ecosystem and try different things. So like when I went to Tumblr, actually, like the reason they hired me was because they're doing kind of native advertising, and a lot of like digital shops and people that were really creative and smart, digital companies that understood the platform were kind of their target buyers at the beginning. So I was a target buyer. So like they knew that I could sort of understand what the pitch could be, And then from there I went to SoundCloud, same thing. Like how can, people like sort of work on, like how can we make this platform useful to brands that want to do interesting stuff? And then somewhere in there when I wrote the book, it was just kind of because a lot of people like you would just always ask me out to coffee, and they'd be like, how did you do this? What did you do? And I realized I didn't really have anyone to talk to. So I just thought I'd just get it all on paper so I could just hand it to them at lunch. And so I wouldn't have to talk about it anymore. Nice. But the inverse kind of happened where like I've since like grown a little bit more skeptical about tech startups, or at least the way they're handled now. And I've kind of like gotten more into consulting companies, and now I work with like sort of an equal mix of both.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing how it works? I'm in the same boat. Like I left my day-to-day role in my agency because I sort of felt like I achieved everything that I wanted to achieve. And then I was, drawn in by technology. But as you get more exposure, you realize that nothing is perfect. Like an agency can be very stable, can be really good, and you sort of start to remember the good parts of it. And then within technology, once you see how tech companies are run and how it all operates, you realize it's not this grand plan that the agency didn't have. All companies are very, they have a lot of things they need to work through at all times. And that's just sort of the more exposure you get, the more you realize that's just how business works.
Yeah, grass is always greener, right? Yeah, it reminds me when I was young and I was working at Ernst & Young, it's one of those big consultancies, but it's a partnership, right? And so there are these partners, and they were just in charge. And, it's kind of like a law firm model. Like if you work under that partner, they're just the boss. And I remember thinking, and it seems so absurd now, I was like, well, this is just like a bunch of like fiefdoms. And this is not very efficient at all. I would love to work at like a publicly traded company because then it's just efficient. Yeah. I had romanticized publicly traded companies as somehow being efficient, which is just kind of a ridiculous notion if you've ever worked at one,
Yeah.
But it was kind of similar with agencies and tech. I like the medium of the internet. I don't know that either side has like a monopoly on vision or anything like that. And so I just kind of bounce around to like the most interesting projects that I can find at any given time.
And I think that's a fair thing for anybody listening to understand as well, is that you can bounce around between cool projects, and you can get the exposure, and you can learn a lot of things, and you can be successful in doing that. And you're an example of that.
Yeah. Like earlier, probably like 2007 or 8, like the partners really started figuring out what we wanted to do. And when it was kind of clear that some of them wanted to run it for a long time and be there for a long time, and others didn't, like me, it became a matter of sort of parking it somewhere, right? Like I was kind of handling all that like operation stuff. So like finance and account and production and things like that. And most of my partners were practitioners of their crafts, and we needed to put it somewhere where they could keep doing it if they wanted. And so that was kind of why we sold. It was sort of understood that I'd probably eventually get out of there. But like the point I'm making is that like it was so important for us to like have those frank conversations. Like, are your life goals? What do you want out of this? What are you doing? Where do you want to be? And if we hadn't had those, I think it would have been really hard. If I had just freaked out and left one day because I couldn't take it anymore because my blood pressure was through the roof, like, I don't, I had good people working on the different departments, but like, I think that would have been a lot worse in a way,
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Just as much as you need, you should have a plan going into it. You need to have a plan to get out of it, or to, at least have that conversation. Because,
well, I say in the book, even if you want to do it forever, like, you got to retire, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could work to your grave, but like, eventually you're going to either like have some great people around you that you want to make partners and it's going to live on forever, or something. So you still have to go through that process, even if you like really don't ever want to do anything but be a designer for your whole life at your own design firm. Like, what are you going to do? Just when you get old, just close shop? I mean, I guess you could, but it's not super financially responsible.
No, it's the worst move you can make. I actually have some people that really need your book, Rick, that I've worked with in the past. So
great,
because I agree.
$7.
Yeah. So, because it's the end game that it's all about, and that is, you need to be honest with yourself about how you're going to get out of this, even if you don't have any intention of getting out of it. Because if you can't do that, then the time will come, and you're going to be scrambling, and you won't be able to get top dollar for your agency. You won't be able to. Nobody's going to care if you sort of just let it die. If you just leave it.
Typically they make you work there for a long time, right? So if you're dying and then you sell it, what are you going to do? You still have to stay there.
Yep.
And the other thing too, like, there's all those people that like all those weird mystical philosophies like The Secret and stuff. I don't really buy into any of those, but what I do believe is like you've envisioned where you want to be, so the millions of little decisions you make along the way are all in cohesion to like support that path, right? Even if you're like, well, I'm going to quit this when I'm 60 and turn it over to my partners, that colors everything you do. And a lot of times, like, I'll get a client now and they're like, I don't really know what we want to do. We didn't really think about it. And, I'm just like a therapist for several months at the beginning before they sort of like find a nice plan to like figure out where they want to be in the future,
Yeah. Okay. So this has been really cool to see your journey. And I know you've written a book about this, so we'll make sure that we link to it in our show notes. And obviously you're going to see a gigantic spike in book sales from people who are interested in this topic. But
great. Someday when I finally get a royalty check, I'll be excited.
Yes, exactly. Is there any, like, what I like to leave on is just asking if you have any advice for somebody who is maybe like 22-year-old Rick just getting into this area. Like, where might they start now? Where should they focus? What type of decisions should they make if they want to accelerate their career in this world?
Well, I think like if you want to be, there's a big if obviously, but if you want to run your own firm ever, there's a million different things to do. And as long as you're learning about one of them, I think you're making progress, right? Like, when I was at Ernst & Young, I felt very trapped. Like I got all the latest tools. I had cool software and had like the fastest Mac, and I loved all that. I could kind of nerd out, but like I just like didn't see a future for me there. But like I learned so much. There's the obvious stuff, like when they decided that we should help with the website, but it was that was 96, and we started Barbarian Group in 2001. So 5 years later, I had to write a proposal, and I was like, oh, I know all about this. Like that was a whole realm of running a business I hadn't thought about that I wasn't going to need to know, but it turned out that period I was in before I had learned it, and that was really useful. I think that like if you want to go that route, there's a lot to learn, and so it's almost very difficult to mess up in the early years as long as you're learning some aspect of business. Another thing, like when we were at Arnold, I was at another job, and they were just really bad about vacations. And so I made this silent pact to just understand that people needed time off, and I would never be one of those people that was neurotic about it. And that just paid off in spades in later years. These tiny little lessons you can learn at every job. And unless you feel like there's nothing, like, pay attention to the parts that you can learn there and get that out of it before you move on.
Awesome. Well, this has been really an enlightening chat, Rick. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I'll make sure that we link to your book and share some of your wisdom in the show notes as well, because this is really helpful, and it's actually been therapeutic for me. So I know I'm not your client, but it felt like, you've gone through a lot of the same things that I have. So it was really helpful for me to hear it too.
Yeah, that's really one thing I learned. I felt so alone when I was doing it. I didn't know anything. I didn't know even who to ask. I knew a lot of people in advertising, but nobody that started companies. And I've since realized that there are so many of them out there, and they're the only one they know in their position, and they think they're alone, and that they're doing something wrong when they're like tight on money. And it's just nice to know that there's a bunch of them out there, and you guys all have something in common.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Rick. Well, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you ever get the opportunity to meet Rick Webb in person, you should take it. This guy is a whole lot of fun, but he's also knowledgeable, and he's so wise that your conversation will make you walk away smarter. I know that I've walked away smarter every time I've talked with Rick, and this conversation in particular was laced with nuggets of agency wisdom. It showed that it's totally cool to have multiple career arcs, and it even demonstrated a path for me for where I might take things in the future with my business. It seems like Rick has reached many of the same conclusions that I'm reaching right now, and he actually was just a few years ahead. Or maybe he was light years ahead, depending on how you look at it. Either way, I really enjoyed this conversation. For show notes, visit Jeffalytics.com/Rick.